So, Cynthia, I will pass it over to you to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Emily. And we are so happy tonight to have Eliot Wessler. He's a retired economist. For the past 10 years, he's been working with a number of grassroots environmental groups that focus on modernizing and rationalizing New Hampshire's solid waste policies. He's worked in Washington, D.C. for 35 years at a number of consulting firms, trade associations, and federal agencies. Most of his work focused on the electric and natural gas utilities, including environmental policy making, but primarily on antitrust matters. He's a graduate of Northern Arizona University and Clark University. He and his wife, Ellen, are very lucky. They live in Whitefield, New Hampshire, a beautiful part of our state, and spend winters in St. Petersburg, Florida. They have 2 grown children who continue to live in Washington, D.C. So we're so happy to have you, Eliot, speaking with us. I'll be collecting the chat as Emily described. And if you just put in your chat maybe to everyone, then Susan Richmond can see them as well. She's going to help me collect chat ideas and questions. Then when Mr. Wessler is finished, I can maybe call on you to ask your question if there's a common question series, and you need to unmute, of course, your audio, and then ask the question, and we can start the discussion after he's finished his presentation. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. So please, Eliot, take it away. I'm going to mute myself.
Thank you for that nice introduction. Full disclosure, I'm not a scientist. I am not a sanitary engineer, and I actually came into this basically as a NIMBYite. Is Casella Waste Systems proposed about 10 years ago to site a landfill only about one mile from where I live in Whitefield, New Hampshire. Prior to that, my experience with landfills was very limited. In Whitefield's small town, about 2,000 people, we buy trash bags from either the grocery store or the gas station in town. We fill up those trash bags and bring them to the transfer center. On one side of the transfer center is bins for recycling, and all that recycling is separated. And on the other side is a chute for those trash bags. And other than that, I really had very limited. I, I had virtually no thoughts about landfills, despite the fact that only about 5 miles from where I do live in Whitefield is probably the second or maybe the third largest landfill in New Hampshire, the NCES landfill in Bethlehem. So with that, can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. With that this is kind of an agenda for what I'd like to talk about, but more than that, really, it's some takeaways, some things that I hope you will take away from the discussion tonight, and start with number one. Even the most technologically advanced landfills leak toxins into the air and water. There's no such thing as a landfill that's not going to disturb the environment. The airborne toxins are methane, carbon dioxide, VOCs, and others. The waterborne toxins, PFAS, which everybody in New Hampshire at this point is familiar with, and heavy metals. Second point I'd like to get across is that maybe most landfills produce significant local, regional, and global impacts. They impact quality of life for people that live nearby. They impact public health for people that live nearby and maybe even far distances, and we'll get to that later. And landfills are obvious contributors to climate change. Third point I'd like you to take away is that landfill regulation in New Hampshire is very weak. But there are some sprouts. There are some reasons to be hopeful. When we've looked at New Hampshire's regulation of landfills compared to other New England states, is New Hampshire's is by far the weakest. It was the GSL landfill that would be about a mile from my home in Dalton, New Hampshire, that really has catalyzed a consensus in the state for reform. Even DES, which seemed to, that's the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, seemed to think there was just nothing wrong with the way we managed and regulated landfills in New Hampshire has come around. And the New Hampshire legislature is coming around. And that's largely, we see a real inflection point since Chris Nunu is gone, and with the election of Governor Ayotte. And then finally, the fourth thing I hope to get across to you is that the New Hampshire public health community can make a difference in this. You have expertise on public health. I think that there's been too little emphasis on the public health implications of landfills in New Hampshire, and I hope that this group and others in the public health community will be more participate more. Yep, thanks. Emily well, let me start, starting at the beginning. The earliest evidence of a landfill comes from Greece in about 3000 BCE, 5,000 years ago. Prior to that, I think archaeologists would say that people just basically dropped their trash where they slept or where they ate. Is the earliest communal waste disposal sites archaeologists called middens. And Emily, I was interested in your take on indigenous peoples. Is where I live in Florida, in St. Petersburg, along the Gulf of Mexico coast. Yeah, thank you. Is indigenous peoples basically their food supply was from the Gulf of Mexico, and middens are everywhere, and they're full of mollusk shells, and in particular oyster shells. And up until the industrial age, that was largely true, is that, middens were just filled with food waste. But early landfills started as communities enlarged. Cities needed to find places to put their waste. Industrial activity increased. And eventually, there became recognition that dumps/landfills are hazardous. It took about until the 1940s in the U.S. For us to come to that realization. There was, and can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. There was some legislation in, let me read it for myself, 1965, regulating landfills, but the real impetus for federal regulation of landfills came in 1976. RCRA was actually amendments to the 1965 bill. And what RCRA did was impose locational restrictions. That doesn't mean that you can't build a landfill in certain places, but it made it hard. The federal regulations made it harder. Where? In floodplains, in wetlands, in seismic zones, and within a radius of 6 miles from airports. The obvious rationale being that landfills attract birds. Birds and planes don't mix very well. Another requirement is that new landfills or RCRA compliant landfills anyway would be required to have liners and leachate collection systems. We're going to talk more about that. The methane produced at landfills would have to be controlled. There'd have to be some groundwater monitoring, recognizing that there is a seepage of what's called leachate from landfills down vertically into the soils and eventually into the groundwater. And also the recognition that even if a landfill is successfully closed, it's capped. Maybe it has some next use, as parkland or something like that, is that the hazard doesn't go away. In fact, the hazard continues significantly in perpetuity. RCRA really forced three big changes in the landscape of landfills in the U.S. The first was because of these federal regulations, a lot of small community landfills were closed, but not all. Some of them were consolidated and expanded. And that's the horizontal consolidation that's taken place in the solid waste industry. There's also been vertical consolidation where the smaller number of larger landfills have been bought up by large companies. So you may be familiar with Waste Management, which is by far the largest solid waste firm in the U.S. Casella and Waste Management owns the Turnkey facility in Rochester. Casella is a big player, not on the national scene, but in New England and in the Mid-Atlantic. And Casella owns landfills pretty much all over New England, including the NCES landfill in Bethlehem. Next slide, please. What's the best we can hope for from a landfill? There's relatively little release of methane and other airborne toxins, relatively little release from leachate of PFAS and other waterborne toxins. And that when the landfill is all closed up, it's capped and it's safe. But that's the hope. It's not necessarily the reality. Can you go to the next slide, please? The reality is that, as the federal EPA has said on a number of occasions, although I wouldn't be surprised if they start renouncing it, is at some point all of the liners that underlay a landfill will leak, even the most sophisticated liners. In the liner, basically a liner is a liner system. There can be layers of gravel, layers of impermeable soil, but ultimately it's hopefully two layers at a minimum of basically plastic sheeting, which is supposed to keep all the toxins from getting into the groundwater. Next slide, please. And leachate is, besides for methane, and we'll get back to methane, really one of the biggest concerns with landfills. Leachate is difficult to manage, and NCES, as we'll talk about later, has not done a very good job of managing leachate. What is it, again, is from the previous slide, maybe I should have said a little bit more about it, is that when it rains, that rain, even for a capped landfill, filters through all of that waste, organic waste, non-organic waste, and produces leachate. The water collects basically at the bottom of the liner, and it has to be pumped out. So the first step in leachate management is basically the collection, the safe collection, hopefully, the pumping and the storage of the leachate. Leachate needs to be stored for some period of time, hopefully a short period of time, on site. In general, there's lots of different configurations for landfills, but in general, the leachate that is stored on site is either shipped through a pipeline to a wastewater treatment facility, or it's trucked in tanker trucks, very large tanker trucks, to a wastewater treatment facility. We'll come back to that point. Some landfills do some pre-treatment of the toxins in the leachate, but that technology is not well developed, and there really aren't that many landfills that are doing that at this point. I already mentioned the transport to wastewater treatment facilities. And then there's the disposal at the wastewater treatment facility. For the NCES landfill in Bethlehem, is that wastewater is trucked to several places, but predominantly Franklin and Concord wastewater treatment facilities. The leachate is not treated terribly well at those facilities, and so the leachate is in effect mixed in with the other effluents that have been collected at the wastewater treatment facility and then discharged in the Merrimack River. Next slide, please. So what are the environmental impacts? As we mentioned, soil and water contamination, air pollution, destruction of habitat is it can be an important issue. It is not always an important issue, and the same for wetlands destruction. Next slide, please. And then there's quality of life impacts. It's the people who live near landfills in general bear significant quality of life impacts. They smell. They tend to be noisy. There's a lot of truck traffic going in and out and on the roads, possibly past the schools in the towns where the landfills are located. Scavenger animals, particularly birds, and they are a vector for all sorts of problems. The birds feed at the landfills, and then many of the birds that feed at the landfills will be looking for a body of water, and they are pooping in that water and otherwise transferring toxins into that water. And then there's the issue of property values. Landfills and have, there is a fair amount of evidence that landfills disturb property values. Next slide, please. The public health impacts. Unfortunately, I've got to go over this quickly. I do not have any background in toxicology or anything remotely related to it. But my understanding, and maybe this would be a source for discussion after the presentation, is that for the airborne and waterborne toxins, particularly the VOCs, causes respiratory distress, cancer, particularly benzene related cancers, and liver and kidney damage. From the hydrogen sulfide from landfills, respiratory and gastrointestinal distress. From the particulate matter, which lingers in the air, some is transported by the wind, some, but also deposits out into the soil. Particulate matter can cause asthma, lung and heart disease, and stroke. And the heavy metals have been associated with developmental delays, neurologic damage, and organ failures. And then we come to, what's dominated the news in New Hampshire for, many years. PFAS. There is airborne PFAS deposition. So it's not just, a waterborne problem. The concentration of PFAS and leachate can be very high depending on, what the waste stream looks like. And the associated health risks are well known to most people in New Hampshire at this point. Hormonal distribution, cancers, immune deficiencies, reproductive issues. Next slide. How do landfills contribute to climate change? The biggest problem is methane. And there is a significant, there's a lot of organics, obviously, in most waste streams. And those organics break down into methane. EPA estimates that 15 to 20% of the total methane released in US comes from landfills. My understanding is that the first biggest source of methane is industrial activity and energy production. The second apparently is from animal digestion, cows burping. Methane control runs the gamut at landfills from virtually nothing to perhaps it's collected and used for energy conversion, or it can be converted to less toxic materials through catalytic conversion. But even the most sophisticated methane capture systems at modern landfills still allow escape of about 10 to 20% of the methane that's produced at landfills. Landfills also release some carbon dioxide and nitrogen oxides, is also greenhouse gases. Another big problem, something I mentioned prior, is that the consolidation in the industry has resulted in fewer landfills. And that means that waste is being trucked much longer distances. So, for example, that landfill in Bethlehem, New Hampshire, the vast majority of it comes from out-of-state or southern tier New Hampshire communities. It's being trucked a long, long distances. And if you've driven north on Interstate 93 at the right time, you can see convoys of trash trucks going to that landfill. Is more states are limiting capacity means that transport is going longer distances. So, for example, Massachusetts, in effect, has a moratorium on new landfill. So the waste that is going to be landfilled that comes from Massachusetts sources is not going to stay in Massachusetts. It's hopefully not coming to New Hampshire, but it is going elsewhere. And then finally is an under the radar problem, all of that leachate, and it's massive amounts of leachate. A fair-sized landfill can produce something on the order of 50,000 gallons of leachate per day. A tanker truck holds between 8 and 10,000 gallons of leachate, and therefore, on average, let's say, is 5 large tanker trucks are making round trips between the landfill and the wastewater treatment facility, if they are in fact using trucks to transport the leachate. Next slide, please. Landfill regulation in New Hampshire has been very weak. New Hampshire DES has, in my opinion, a well-deserved reputation that if you want to build it, we'll find a way. And that's not only true for industrial activities, it's certainly true for landfills. It's much easier to site a landfill in New Hampshire than, for example, our neighboring states of Vermont or Maine. In fact, the GSL landfill that's proposed for Dalton, right near my home, if all other things equal, if that landfill were just across the state line in Maine, it wouldn't even be considered as a suitable site for the landfill. Another issue with landfill regulation is that DES rarely fines landfill operators for their permit violations. And we'll talk about the fact that there's been many permit violations at one landfill in particular. And there's been no effort to limit the amount of out-of-state waste going into our landfills. It's currently just under 50%. DES, and for that matter, Governor Sununu and the legislature under Governor Sununu sort of wrung their hands, that thinking that there's nothing they can do about that. But it's created a lot of anger in the state that New Hampshire is perhaps on a glide path for becoming the de facto dump for all of New England. Is what's the situation of landfills in the state? Is there's about 250 closed. These were, small towns that basically had their own dump slash landfill. They've been closed. There's now 9 operational landfills. Coakley, which is, notorious at this point, located adjacent to Pease Air Force Base, was an unlined municipal landfill. It started taking in industrial waste from the Air Force Base and other sources. It's been designated a Superfund site ever since 1986. Of the 9 operational landfills, and Coakley is obviously closed as a landfill. Of the 9 operational landfills in our state, 6 are double-lined, 1 is single-lined, and 2 are unlined. These are the old landfills. 6 are municipally owned, and the 3 biggest are privately owned. And the big 3 are, I think I mentioned, Turnkey and Rochester, Mount Carberry, which is just outside of Berlin, in the North Country, about 40 miles from where I live, and NCES, which I've also mentioned, which, in my opinion, has been a disaster. Next slide, please. It's a pretty sorry story about the NCS landfill. It started life as a small town landfill. It was bought by Casella in 1991. After getting a toehold within the community, Casella just kept expanding and expanding without any support in the town. But they've been very successful, very aggressive and very successful at using litigation to get what they wanted. There's lots of problems at that landfill. It's been a constant nuisance. All of those quality of life problems have cropped up at NCS. The largest landfill in New Hampshire, I'm sorry, the largest leachate spill in New Hampshire and probably in all of New England occurred in 2021. DES is still investigating that spill, what the causes were, what the impacts of that spill is. And as I mentioned, they've been cited many times for violations, mostly involving leachate management. And most recently, PFAS has been detected from seeps near the landfill and going into the Ammonoosuc River, which is a feeder stream into the Connecticut River. NCS is scheduled to close in a year or 2, but it's not a done deal at this point. So, our grassroots environmental groups are watching that very closely. Next slide, please. Why is there so much opposition to Casella's proposed GSL landfill in Dalton? Because it's the wrong time. New Hampshire doesn't need any additional landfill capacity. By statute, New Hampshire's landfills are supposed to be for the purpose of disposing of trash that originates in New Hampshire. As I mentioned, is up to 50% of the trash coming into New Hampshire's landfills is coming from out of state. Um, and so it's the wrong trash, and it's also the wrong place. It's virtually right next to Forest Lake State Park, which really was the trigger for Governor Ayotte's at least initial opposition to the GSL landfill. She's made many public statements at this point. It just seems crazy to her to put a landfill so close to a beloved lake and state park. But more than that, the site is highly permeable soils, which means going back to the diagram, the rain goes through the mass of garbage and leachate comes out the bottom. Well, in permeable soils, that process is very, very quick. In non-permeable soils like clays, which is where landfill should be located, that process is very slow. And the importance of that is, excuse me, the importance of that is that if the leachate does pierce through the liner, is that there's time to it be detected and time to mitigate. In permeable soils, time to detect and time to mitigate may be very, very short. And finally, it's a greenfield site. It's been dubbed by Casella as an industrial site, but there is some logging, there is some light industrial activity going on the site. But again, it's right next to a state park, and it's just about near pristine wetlands, woodlands, meadows. Next slide, please. Is sort of starting at the beginning is the GSL project is a textbook case for political ecology, another name, if you will, for environmental justice. But whereas environmental justice is generally associated with problems created by land uses in communities of color, political ecology, is kind of a term of art that's more broad. So sort of at the highest level is you have states that don't want to bury their trash in their own states. They want to export it to other states. And you have the issue of Massachusetts trash coming into New Hampshire. Kind of at the micro level, what this depicts is that the landfill would be located in Dalton, but in the extreme southwest corner of Dalton, virtually all the people that live in Dalton live on the upwind and up gradient side of Dalton Mountain. So they would largely be unaffected by the landfill. Is Casella was very wise, if you will, in part in choosing the site because they are proposing basically to pay people's property taxes for about 25 years. And some people in Dalton, it's split probably right down the middle, but some people in Dalton think, well, this isn't going to affect me, and somebody's coming in to pay my property taxes. That is not a bad deal. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there's a lot going on in the legislature now, in particular since Governor Ayotte has been inaugurated. Over the last 5 years, during the reign of Governor Sununu, there were a lot of bills. The vast majority of them got passed in the House, but were either killed in the Senate or in at least one case was vetoed by Sununu. And some of those bills were to restrict landfills not to be any closer than 2 miles from a state park, not any closer than a half a mile from a permanent water body. Up until about 3 months ago, DES's rules only require that a landfill be no closer than 200 feet. They are patting themselves on the back because they've actually increased that amount to 500 feet. Is legislation so that new landfills would be sited only in non-permeable soils, a moratorium on new landfills until there's really a good think through on the part of the legislature enforcing DES to think through its rules, and also limiting the amount of out-of-state waste. Again, it seems to be a very powerful political issue, telling people that half of the trash that gets landfilled in New Hampshire comes from out-of-state and mostly from Massachusetts. Tends to perk people's interest. There are current bills. The governor has proposed a 1-year moratorium and establishing a siting committee, and the siting committee would, for the first time, really be kind of a look at what the costs of, in terms of social costs, environmental costs, quality, public health costs of a landfill. That at present, that's not really being done. It would require consideration. Another bill would require consideration whether a landfill is in the public interest. As I just mentioned, is right now New Hampshire DES considers the public interest only to be whether landfill capacity is needed, not whether, what costs exist, who will bear those costs, and whether in fact the benefits exceed the costs. There's also legislation emanating from the Senate, which is surprising, for a 6-year moratorium to study the efficacy of landfilling versus incineration. There seems to be a lot of interest in exploring the benefits and costs of incineration of trash versus landfilling. As you can imagine, there's a lot of atmospheric issues associated with incineration. Next slide, please. I think the public health community can play a really important role in the next couple of years, is to try and modernize and rationalize how we manage waste in the state. As I mentioned, Governor Ayotte's proposal for a 1-year moratorium. I am not a big fan of it. When I read the text that was in her budget resolution, I see lots and lots of loopholes. But she has, said all the right things, that she is committed to protecting what's best about New Hampshire, that is clean air and clean water. She says she wants to find a way to limit out-of-state trash, consistent with the Commerce Clause, which, has been a stumbling block. The Commerce Clause does not permit states to, in effect, to interfere with interstate commerce. That is the province of federal regulation. Although she hasn't brought it up very much, we have high hopes that she's going to be kind of keen on waste diversion, composting, more efficient packaging of, the things that we buy and that we throw out and that end up in landfills. I think also the public health community has a role, and I would like to see them take some more positions on legislative initiatives is there's actually been, in all the legislative hearings that have occurred, there's actually been very little discussion about the public health impacts of landfilling. Is what are the benefits of landfilling versus incineration? Obviously, it depends on the sites, so, these are not, that is not a generic discussion that one can have, but I think it's going to be an important discussion in the future. Ethical considerations for preferring brownfield sites to greenfield sites for any new landfills, and encouraging creative solutions to limit packaging and PFAS use in particular. And the next slide, please. And this is just for your reference, is North Country Alliance for Balanced Change, is the grassroots environmental organization that's really leading the opposition to GSL and to the landfill, the proposed landfill in Dalton. But there are other organizations that they work very closely with. Conservation Law Foundation is very active on solid waste issues in New England. The Just Zero has just published, I think, a very well done take on landfills and injustice, the political ecology considerations that I mentioned. And I think you can access that by clicking on that. And then finally, two reporters who are doing, I think, great jobs, one in particular, on covering solid waste management issues, particularly Claire Sullivan, who just arrived on the scene about a year ago and is mostly writing for New Hampshire Bulletin, but also Shruti, and I won't try to pronounce her last name, who is a reporter for the Concord Monitor and also has a bi-monthly, I'm not sure, is Trash Talk newsletter. And with that, I'm done. Happy to try to answer your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eliot. That was an incredible presentation, and I appreciate you going into depth on New Hampshire specifics as well as kind of the issue as a whole. So, Cynthia, I will pass it over to you to start the discussion, and we can either have questions in the chat that Cynthia can then call on you, or we can have folks raise their virtual hands as well. So over to you, Cynthia.
Right, thank you. Thank you. Yes, we don't have a lot of questions that I'm seeing in the chat, but I noticed that the Phillips Health Ministry person representing that group has posted some really good resources that folks can look at. And as we mentioned before, the information on the chat would be shared along with the link to the copy of this presentation will be shared on your website, on the your group's website. So I'd like to invite the person representing the Phillips Health Ministry tell us their perspective. And obviously they've been following the fraud of plastic recycling and they've been following eating trash. So those are two great topics of conversation there. Can you raise a question or make a comment, please?
Sure, and thank you to Mr. Wessler for sharing that information. You started your presentation with saying that you weren't an expert, but actually you are. We know that necessity is the mother of invention, right? And because this is a direct impact to you, and it means a lot to you and your family, you've dug deep into the issue. So consider yourself someone with lived experience, and you are an expert. I would also like to share that in Hartford, Connecticut, which is an environmental justice community, we have a landfill. I'm not sure if Miss Helen Nixon is on the line under one of Miss Kirsten X.
Yes, I am.
Okay, so she can share with you a little bit more about that effort to close that landfill, but I shared those resources in the chat because there's something that we all can do to limit what goes into the waste streams that impacts us all. Composting and buying products in a environmentally friendly and conscious way, and also how we use the various products that we do. We all can have a direct impact on the outcome. The last thing I would say is, though we have what we call traditional landfills, there are a whole lot of other sites that may not bear that name, but that are doing just as much damage, like car junkyards that not only have crunched cars, but all the fuels and chemicals that are inside the cars that are not vacated before they start crushing them, that seep into our groundwater as well. We have the urban fill from construction, different sand depositories that have, dirty sand in our communities. We already know about the plastic recycling that actually don't always get to be quote unquote recycled. They get taken away en masse, but they don't always get reused. So there are a lot of things that we have to make our communities conscious of, so that we can do a better job upfront of minimizing, and then the focus on the cleanup is secondary, right? We have to minimize what's going in, but then we got to deal with what we've already created, which is horrific. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Right, thank you.
And I'm sorry, one last thing. Mr. Wessler mentioned about the methane. The food decomposition is another huge contributor to the methane. So if we can increase our composting and reduce our waste and find ways to use the food instead of wasting it and spoiling it. And there are a lot of different ideas about that in that news article that we might be able to generate some positive movement.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you. Thank you. I noticed that one of your colleagues, Kirsten Eck, also just posted something about the EPA perhaps losing many of its staff. This might have effects because realize that the EPA does regulate Title V air permits and some other permits. So if we're looking to rely on the EPA permit review process, we might not be able to do much of that at all in the future. So Kirsten, did you want to comment a little bit more on some of the things you've seen over the years associated with landfills and maybe medicine?
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to have this opportunity to hear Mr. Wessler. And I just, when Angela Harris was just speaking, she alluded that Miss Helen Nixon is on the call, which is absolutely fantastic because Miss Helen Nixon is a real hero here in Connecticut and specifically in Hartford. She's won the Unsung Community Hero Award from the United Way. She's won too many awards to count. And I wondered if she'd be willing to speak because she is the person who tackled the giant landfill in Hartford and got it capped. And her legacy is with us every day. And a real hero. She had the lived experience of being this landfill's neighbor and took it on. So I wondered if she could speak.
Okay, I was trying to get okay. I'm Helen Nixon, and yes, and thanks so much for allowing me to speak. And Michael, you did an excellent job with that presentation, okay? And that's one of my favorite. I was very instrumental in helping to close one of the largest landfill. I don't know if in Connecticut or in Hartford, okay? And that was, I think it was back in the, during the 19 something or maybe 2000 and something. But we successfully closed that landfill. It was a huge landfill. It started as a hole in the ground when I moved here, But by the time we had it closed, it was a huge mountain, and that mountain is still there. But we were very successful in closing that. That landfill caused a lot of problem on my street alone. We had quite a few people that died from cancer, respiratory system diseases, and all of that. And we contributed to the landfill and all the dead birds and the noise and the odor. We put up with that for a few years, and then we decided no more. But we went to the state DEP and the federal EPA got involved, and we worked very hard, and it took us about a year and a half or 2 years to get it closed. But we successfully closed that landfill. But I have a question now. I wanted to just say, I'm thinking, since we closed that, I'm wondering, is it being managed? And I'm thinking about that, listen to what Michael was saying. I wonder, is that landfill being managed? Do you manage a closed landfill? How do you manage a closed landfill? Because I understand that someone discovered there was a hole in the lining, and I was thinking that that's a violation, and we could have that here where the leachates are. It's a violation with that. So that's something we have to work on to deal with to see if that's really affecting us here. And I need to know, because people are still getting sick, and the landfill is still there. So that is another issue we need to deal with, to talk about, because it's still there, and I don't know how well it's being managed after it was closed.
Yes, thank you. That's a good question. And I think we can think about that in New Hampshire. If we have 250 small city landfills, municipal landfills that have been so-called closed, this is a bigger issue. What do you think? What do you think, Eliot?
I don't think I'm muted. Can you hear me? I don't think many of them have gotten the attention that they need. I think many of them, I'm not an expert on this, but many of them have basically been closed by, in effect, bulldozing dirt over the top of the landfill. That there's probably very little oversight of airborne releases, and my guess is virtually no oversight of leachate getting into the groundwater. It's a huge problem. Is trying to motivate state of New Hampshire to tackle a problem like that is absolutely important, but a very, very big job.
Okay, thank you.
I do see, Cynthia, that Michael's had his hand up virtually. Michael,
Sorry,
ask
I
your
couldn't
question?
see that. Yeah, I can't see the hands. Good, thanks.
Hi.
Thanks.
My name is Michael Hanlon, and I wanted to thank Eliot for his presentation. He started off by, suggesting that he was not a sanitary engineer. Full disclosure on my end, I was a sanitary engineer back in 1967 when I graduated from college. After 1972, I became an environmental engineer. And I had nothing to do with the change in the name, but all of a sudden, a sanitary engineer became an environmental engineer. So if you do the math, you could probably figure out that I've been retired for about 15 years, but I still keep my license just in case somebody calls. And my good friend Clark Corson did call me about 3 or 4 years ago to join the board of Collaborative Solid Waste Strategies. You may have heard of us. We are a startup kind of not-for-profit advocacy group advocating for change in New Hampshire. So Eliot, I listened with great interest to Eliot's presentation because I figured there was going to be a lot of mistakes and errors, but I really didn't find anything wrong with what he said. I kind of agree with everything he said.
Mhm.
So I live in Massachusetts, another part of the full disclosure. I'm working with Clark and others in New Hampshire. And I see, since I spent a lot of my engineering career dealing with solid waste issues, I have come full circle. We should not be relying in the future on landfills. Landfills are bad. I don't think there's anybody on this call that wouldn't agree with that. We need to stop burying and stop burning our trash. The one interesting thing I thought that Eliot said was the governor wants to look at incineration as an alternative to landfilling. The only thing that that does is reduce the volume from by 85, 90%. You still have 10% left, and that needs to go into a landfill. So I would hope that, the challenge that we have in New Hampshire is what I will call changing the paradigm, because you are not going to stop waste from my state, Massachusetts, coming to your state. That is not going to change until the landfills fill up. And if you have 10 years of capacity left, you got a 10-year window to figure out what to do about it. You can either build more landfills, which I would not recommend, or you could start thinking about what are we going to do to change the paradigm. And I'll tell you what I'm thinking about in my community. You're a state. My community is, I'm thinking about mandatory recycling, not voluntary, mandatory. Our regulations say it's mandatory, but it doesn't get enforced. You also need to think about EPR legislation and bottle bills. Now, I know I'm talking to a bunch of New Hampshire folks who
No, those are
probably
great.
won't like that, but you can't be against landfills and against incinerators without being for something. You need to be for something that's different than what we've always been doing. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Michael. We're all past our 7 o'clock time, but we do have a question, a hand that's been up. Mark Mitchell, you've had your hand up for a minute, so can we fit in Mark, Emily?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So many of you folks are still here. Thank you for holding on past 7 o'clock, and then we'll let Eliot perhaps make a conclusion if he'd like to. How does that sound?
Good.
So please, Mark, tell us your question or your comment, please. And thank you again, Michael, for your points as well. We really needed to hear that. So Mark?
Yes, I'm also a public health and environmental health physician in Hartford, and where we do have the landfill and a trash incinerator, or we had the landfill and we had a trash incinerator. And we also had the same issue in the 1980s where each town had its own town dump. And as the products that we use become more toxic in the town dumps, those leak into the groundwater and contaminated people's wells all around the state. And so then they decided to close them all and open up incinerators. And I agree with everything that's been said. Incineration is not the answer. You need to be able to treat the trash, recycle as much as possible, compost, anaerobic digestion, in order to reduce the toxicity of what goes into landfills. Yeah, when we burn our trash, a third of it wound up as solid waste that needed to be landfilled anyway. So I agree with things. With everything that's been said before, but it's really important. The incinerators provide toxic air, and a lot more people are exposed to the toxicity in the air the mercury, the lead, and other toxics in the air from incineration. So I would not at all recommend incineration. So thank you.
Right. So thank you. Really important lessons from Connecticut. So Eliot, would you like to conclude? And I think we also have a message from the New Hampshire Network about programs and also opportunities to track some of the bills that Eliot mentioned. So I don't know if we have a chance to squeeze that in as well. There's some great citizen action opportunities that are on a next slide and next programs. But Eliot, did you want to wrap up any of the points that you've heard? And obviously,
sure.
We're here with you.
Only this, that this group is obviously well versed in the issue of landfills, which delights me. And again, suggests that I think there's an important role for the public health community, not only in New Hampshire, but probably in other New England states as well, to become more active on this issue and work towards their strengths, which is to educate the public and decision makers that there are big stakes involved in the decisions we make about how we manage our solid waste.
Good, thank you, thank you. And Susan, did you have Emily and Susan? Did you have a last invitation for people to follow up?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And thank you so much, Eliot, for the presentation and the moderation. And thank you so much to everyone for that really interactive and great discussion. And special thanks to our Connecticut folks for joining and sharing those perspectives, because they're super helpful. I will be sending out a recording and links to everything in the chat. And then Susan, if you want to share a slide, if you have it, for New Hampshire folks for some actions, feel free to do so now.
Thanks, Emily. Real quickly, whoa, no, oh dear, I'm in the wrong place. I do this so often. Let me just say, because there aren't that many people here that are from New Hampshire. New Hampshire Network is a coalition of people that realize that we need to get more active in our government because it is not responsive to our needs. And if you're interested, we're at newhampshirenetwork.org, and we have a legislative spreadsheet every week telling you what bills are being voted on, and you're allowed, and thank you, Mary Beth, who just posted that, newhampshirenetwork.org. You can go there and see what bills are coming up. There are a lot of landfill bills this year about how close a landfill can be sited near water, and that there has to be a test by a hydrologist to make sure it is scientifically sound. So get involved in the process by letting your own representative know, so that they will vote correctly when it finally comes to a House vote. In addition, we're trying to get rid of plastics where we can, a little bit, just to have there be less landfill. And I'll have Emily include the link that you can get to sign on to our plastic petition, to try but only New Hampshire people, to try and have there be less free plastic at every grocery store checkout. There's so much plastic to begin with, and that's an easy place to start. We just don't need that. And I am so pleased and grateful. Thank you to New Hampshire Healthy Climate for inviting us, and Eliot for your really erudite and understandable discussion of landfills.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Susan. And I will follow up with all these resources. And thank you again, Eliot, for joining us tonight.
Good night.
Have a good night, everyone.